All right, 1.6, the design of experiments. This is the last section in chapter 1. And in this section, we're going to talk a little bit more about designed experiments and kind of how we set them up. We've talked a lot about studies and how we make sure we can set up a survey correctly and do those observational studies. Now we're going to spend a little bit of time on the design of experiments. So to start off, a researcher conducts an experiment by assigning subjects to certain experimental conditions and then observing the outcome on the response variable. Again, that's the big difference between the experiment and the study. In the experiment, we are controlling what happens. We are forcing people into one group or another and then choosing what kind of treatment those different groups get. So let's go over some variables. We have experimental unit, and I talked about that. That is the subject of the experiment, whether that's a person or an animal, a mouse, a monkey, it could be a car, it could be anything. But that is an experimental unit when we're dealing with experiments. They're the things that are being tested upon. Next, we have the word treatments or the concept of treatments. That is the different experimental conditions. So if we're testing the effectiveness of aspirin, maybe the different treatments are 10 milligrams of aspirin, 15 milligrams of aspirin, and 20 milligrams of aspirin. So we would have 3 different treatments because each of those different amounts is a different treatment group, and we would separate those groups, and each group would get a different treatment. We also have a placebo. A placebo is designed to look and taste and smell just like the treatment, but it is simply a sugar pill. And by sugar pill, it means it should have no effect. So if we have 3 different treatments of aspirin, to make sure that aspirin is actually working, we would have a 4th group that would just be taking that placebo to see if simply taking a pill actually has a benefit. And then off of the treatment and the placebo, we have 2 different groups. We have a treatment group, which is a group of people that is getting one of our treatments. So in this case, either 10, 15, or 20 milligrams of aspirin. And then we have the control group. And the control group is the group that gets the placebo. Recently, I read, actually, I guess not as recently as it used to be, probably 4 years ago now, 3-4 years ago, something like that. I read an article, and I've read some since then that are kind of poking holes in the first one I read. But the idea was that there was a conference in New York City where there was a bunch of statisticians, doctors, medical researchers, things like that, that were all meeting up, and they were working on the concept of treating people with placebo. So using the placebo as an actual treatment. And I've since read more stuff that is kind of poo-pooing on that idea. And a lot of people don't like that concept. They think it's very kind of pseudoscience-y. It's make-believe and things like that. But it's a very new field. And there has been some research done onto it. It's not fully fledged out. But the first article I read was dealing with irritable bowel syndrome. And irritable bowel syndrome is something where your digestive tract, depending on what you eat, it can cause you a lot of pain, diarrhea, indigestion, that type of stuff, and can be incredibly painful. And it's very hard to treat. We're not 100% sure what causes it. We don't know if it's an allergy or a food or a disease or a virus. There's a lot of unknown things about IBS, irritable bowel syndrome. And so these researchers that were thinking about or think that the placebo might actually be a way of helping people, treating people, came up with this research plan, this experiment that they were going to do. And they put out a advertisement saying, hey, if you've had or you have IBS and it is not under control with current medication, we have a new medication we'd like you to try. We find it very effective as a last resort. If your current medication isn't working, let us try this new medication. So they came in, they got people, They gave them this new medication. They said it should work. It works great for people who aren't getting much better based on current medication. Try this new stuff. It's great. So people took this new medication. They took it, then they brought them back in several weeks later and said, hey, how's it going? Most of those people recorded much improvement. So most of their symptoms were gone. They were able to keep their IBS under control using this new medication. And then the researcher said, awesome, thank you. We're now ending our trial, so we can't give you the medication anymore. But if this goes to market, we'll make sure we let you know, and we'll give you this medication again. So they had to take the new medication away. Shortly after, not shortly after, but like 2, 3, 4 weeks after, they kept sending kind of questionnaires out to the people that participated in this experiment, asking them, hey, have your symptoms returned? How long did it take for your symptoms to return? Things like that. And almost all of the people that got better with the new treatment, once they were stopped giving that medicine, the IBS symptoms started coming back. So the researchers pulled those people back into their office, the doctor's office, and said, hey, so we have to be upfront with you right now. That medication we gave you, that helped your symptoms, that made those symptoms kind of go away. It wasn't actually medicine. It was a placebo. It did absolutely nothing. There was no medicine in it. It was just a placebo. But if you want, we can give you that same medicine again. But remember, it's not really medicine. It's just a placebo. There's nothing in it. Would you like us to give you more of this placebo pill, this medicine that we gave you the first time? Some of the people said no. Some of the people said yes. For the people that said yes, they said, okay, after a couple of weeks, we're going to continue to follow up with you. The researchers found that the people who continued to take that placebo, even though they knew it was a placebo, had the same effect as before they knew it was a placebo. And that was one of the big research articles that got this kind of movement started in the, let's see if we can use the placebo, which is kind of like the power of the mind type of thing, and if we can use that to help people out. Why did it work? How did it work? What was the mechanism behind that? And so that is a very new field of research. And to be perfectly honest, it is a field that is looked down upon by a lot of other doctors and researchers as being very pseudoscience, being, oh, it's not real medicine. You're not really doing stuff. It's kind of fake and wishy-washy and wooey and stuff like that. And so it's interesting to be part of that and going through and kind of reading articles from both sides. But it's a very new field. If you're interested in being a researcher, being a doctor, things like that, you should take a look at that. There's lots of papers about the effect of placebo and how you can use placebos to help people. All right. So we just talked a lot about the placebo effect. That is, people who are given nothing still get better, and we're not sure why that is or what causes that. But that is what, when someone says that's a placebo effect, it means you're not given anything, but you still seem to be getting better. And typically, that placebo effect is much larger on things that are subjective. So pain level is one where you see a very high impact on placebo because it's subjective. There's no objective way to measure the amount of pain someone is in. So if someone twists their ankle and they say they're in a lot of pain, and then you give them what they think is an aspirin or pain medication, because they took something that makes them think they should feel less pain, if you ask them 15 minutes after they've taken that pain medication, there's a very good chance, whether you actually gave them pain medication or not, they'll say that they are in less pain. And that's the idea of a placebo effect. And it can be very hard to know what is and what isn't actually working, especially with those kind of subjective things like pain. The Hawthorne effect is similar to the placebo effect, but takes place in observational studies. The Hawthorne effect is named after a psychologist back in the Industrial Revolution times, with the last name of Hawthorne. And he came up with the observation, or he released a statement basically that said, like the placebo effect, if you're trying to maximize a factory's output, and that was during the Industrial Revolution when assembly lines were kind of first coming into being a thing, factories and plants wanted to figure out what was the most cost-effective, most productive way of setting up their assembly line. How bright do the lights need to be? How long should people work? Should people get a break? All of these types of things. And so this psychologist went through and was hired by companies to make their factories as productive as possible. And what he realized was anytime he made a change to the environment, he saw an increase in production. So let's say everyone goes home for the weekend on Friday. On Monday, they come back and they notice that the lights are on brighter. He wanted to see if increased lighting would increase productivity. So he increased the lights, and it turned out that week, people were more productive than they usually were. He said, oh, okay, well, it looks like maybe the lighting plays an impact. So he's like, okay. So after that week, they go home on Friday, they come back on Monday, and this time they notice the lights are turned down, but even turned down even lower than what they were before. So like even below like kind of the normal level. And that increased production. What he found was anytime he made a change, it increased production. And so what he found, or what came to be this Hawthorne effect, is the idea that if people think they're being watched, they're going to behave differently. So if you're a factory worker and you notice that some of the stuff in your factory have changed, that could lead you to believe that there's your boss or someone else watching to see how productive you are. And because you feel that someone's watching you, you're going to be more productive. It's the same concept as if I show up to class and then halfway through class, I see 3 or 4 administrators walk into class, I'm going to start acting differently. My bosses are here now. I'm going to still teach my class, but I may do it a little bit differently. I may call on people more. I may try and write a little bit neater or speak a little bit more clearly, but I'm going to change my behavior because I know that people are watching me. And that's the idea of the Hawthorne effect. It is getting, and similar to the placebo effect, in that you're getting the results you want, but it's not because of the changes you're actually making. It's because people know that they're being watched, and so they're trying harder than they normally would. And that's the idea of the Hawthorne effect. All right, next thing we're going to talk about is blinding, and how do you do blinding? What does blinding mean? And there's 3 types of blinding. The first type of blinding that's not in the notes is none. There is no blinding. Everyone knows what's happening. The first level of blinding is called single blind, and that is when the person being interviewed or being in a treatment group doesn't know which treatment they're getting. So this was an example of like a blind taste test. You go to a supermarket or a mall, and they're seeing, do people like Coke or Pepsi better? And there's 2 little Dixie cups. One says A, one says B. You toast both of those cups, and you're like, oh, I think B tastes better. You don't know what is in cup A or cup B, but the person that's asking you the question, or the researcher that's standing behind the table, knows which one's A and which one's B. So you say, oh, I like B better. And they say, oh, that was Coke. You like Coke better than Pepsi. That is a single blind test. When you, the experimental unit, don't know which treatment you're in, that's single blind. The next level, and this is the gold standard of an experiment, is a double blind study. And that means you don't know, the experimental unit doesn't know which treatment they're in. It also means the person talking to the experimental unit doesn't know which group they're in. They don't know if they're in a treatment group or a control group. Any sort of medical experiment, if you're testing out a new drug, these are going to be double-blind studies. In order to do a double-blind study, there has to be more than 2 levels then. So in a double-blind study, let's say they're testing a new cancer treatment, a cancer drug that's supposed to help cancer patients. So in this study, they would have the patient who has the cancer. They would not know whether they're getting the new drug treatment or if they were getting a placebo. Then you have the doctor that is interviewing them, that is doing all of the work, talking to them, examining them, all of that stuff. That doctor also would not know if that patient is getting the new cancer drug or if they're getting a placebo. And then one level above that doctor would be the research group. That research group, who never has any contact with the doctor or with the patient, they're the ones that would know whether or not the person is getting the new drug or getting the placebo. And the reason it's done that way is kind of twofold. One, it takes responsibility away from the doctor. It would not be very fair to a doctor to say, hey, you have this patient you've been talking to and kind of building a rapport with that has cancer. We have a new drug treatment that they're going to get, except this patient, patient A, actually, you're not going to give them the new cancer drug. You're just going to give them a placebo. So they're not going to get better. But we still need you to talk to them and interview and examine them. And you can't give away any hints that they got the placebo and they're not getting the new drug. So by removing that knowledge away from the doctor doesn't have that burden where he knows he's talking to someone who's not actually getting the medication that could help them. So that's why that double-blind study is so important, because it takes that pressure, that burden off of the doctors that are interacting with the patients, and it puts that burden on the researchers. Those researchers aren't talking to the patients. They don't know the patients. They don't probably know the patients' names. All they have are probably medical records, and they've given each patient a number. And so they probably just refer to those patients by numbers to kind of dehumanize it from them, because as kind of harsh and mean as it sounds, they don't want to look at those patients as people. They're doing experiments. They're treating this as a scientific experiment, and so they just want to know about the data. How effective is this medication? And so to try and make it easier on them, they want to dehumanize that process as much as possible. They don't want to think about the fact that they're not giving people a potentially life-saving drug. We have patient A getting medicine A and patient B getting medicine B, and now let's see what happens. So that's the difference between single blind and double blind. And take a second, read these 3 examples, and determine if they are single blind, double blind, or neither. Pause the video. All right, so let's read through these and determine which type of blinding we have. First one, we have an experiment which is done to determine the effectiveness of a new antidepressant medication. The individuals in the experiment are randomly assigned to a treatment and control groups. The psychologist knows who is receiving the new drugs and evaluates the patients once a month. Single, double, or neither. And this is single blind. The patients don't know if they're getting the actual antidepressant medication or if they're getting a placebo. However, the psychologist who's doing the interviews does know which one is which. B, a personal trainer wishes to determine the effectiveness of a new workout routine versus a cardio-only workout. The individuals are divided into 2 groups and are randomly assigned to a treatment or control group. The personal trainer knows who is doing each workout, evaluates strength and endurance every 2 weeks. So in this case, the control group would be the cardio only group. The treatment group would be the other group that has that new workout routine. This case, this is neither. It has no blinding. The personal trainer assigns them to the group, so he obviously knows whether they're doing the new workout or the cardio only. But if I have to do a workout or I have to do cardio, I know which group I'm in. You're not going to trick me into thinking I'm in the cardio only group if you have me lifting weights. Or you're not going to trick me into thinking I'm in the lifting weights group if all you have me doing is running around or doing a Stairmaster or something like that. So both groups know which group everyone is in. And then the last one, an experiment is done to determine the effectiveness of a new antidepressant medication. So very similar setup to part A. However, in this case, the individuals are randomly assigned. The psychologist who does not know who is receiving the new drug is the one that does the evaluations. So in this case, it's a double-blind experiment because the people taking the medication don't know what they have, and the person doing the interviews and the evaluation also doesn't know. All right. Talking about a little bit about the design of experiments now, kind of same way we talked about how we can get samples for our survey, we're going to talk about how we can choose groups for our experiment. The first way is very similar to a simple random sample. It is just a randomized experiment, meaning you get a group of people that meet the qualifications to be in your experiment. So everyone in this group, let's say you get 50 people that are going to try a new cholesterol medication. All 50 people fall into the criteria needed to be into this group. So they're all kind of in the same genre. And then you just randomly assign people into either the treatment group or the placebo group or control group. So you number everyone and then you go through and you have a random number generator, and the first 25 numbers that come up, they get put into a treatment group, and then everyone else goes to the control group. That is the idea behind a randomized experiment. Same concept as a simple random sample. Next, we have a matched pairs design. In a matched pairs design, as the name implies, this is where participants in the experiment are paired up. Ooh. There we go. Are paired up so that they're related in some way. So related in some way. That some way depends on what you're going to be testing or what your experiment is. If you're experimenting on, I don't know, let's say sunscreen, then you would want people to be matched up based on maybe skin type, skin tone, maybe where they live. Maybe people that live further north don't tan as well, or they're more susceptible to getting skin burn or sunburns. And so if you're testing sunscreen, you want to match people up based on something that you think is going to make a difference to how effective sunscreen is. If you're testing an online homework versus traditional textbook homework for a math class, maybe you're going to match up the two different groups based on how good they are at math. So you look at math scores and you make sure that you have some people that are high ACT, SAT math scores in each group, and you have some that are low ACT and SAT scores in each group. So what you're matching people on matters based on what you are testing. It could be IQ, it could be height, it could be weight, it could be left-handed, right-handed, whatever you're trying to test, that's what you determine how you're going to match people up with. One of the best matched pairs groups are identical twins. I don't know if we have any twins in my class. Generally, I have it like at least one set of twins in my classes. So I've heard from twins about this, but if you're an identical twin, there's a very good chance that you or your parents have gotten papers asking you to be involved in different types of research. I had a couple pairs of twins before the pandemic. So what is that, like 4 years now? 4 years ago, that actually made fairly good money every month by being in different studies. They would put a twin in each group. So one twin was a control, one twin was the treatment group. And because how identical everything is about twins, theoretically, the only difference is that treatment. And so you get very clear, you're able to hold a lot of those variables consistent. And so you get much better data when you're looking at identical twins. So if you're a twin, I'd be interested to know if you're part of those researchers and what research were you involved in and things like that. I find it very fascinating. But you can also do matched pairs on like a pre and post. So you'll see this in when we do our Alive at 25 stuff at Arapahoe High School. They pull up a van into the Circle Drive, and usually they have like the drunk goggles. So they'll put you in, there's a driving simulator, and you do the driving simulator normally, and they record your time, and they put a pair of goggles on that is supposed to replicate the feeling of being drunk. And then they put you through the same obstacle course again, this time with the goggles. And the idea is to show you how much worse you are at that obstacle course while wearing those goggles, i.e., how bad you are at driving while you're impaired with alcohol. And so that's another type of matched pairs where they're looking at the same person, but instead of changing the person, they're performing that treatment in between tests. Another common example of this is a pre and post test. So I say, how effective is my teaching style? Let me give all of my students a pre-test, and I'll grade that pre-test. Then I'll teach, and I'll give the post-test and see the improvement between pre-test and post-test. And then I could use that as a measure of how effective my teaching is. And it's a matched pairs experiment because the same person is taking the test before and after. This is a visual example of a setup and how someone could go through and set up a matched pairs experiment. And then there's the two different cases of how you could match someone up. So you match someone up based on a characteristic, or you measure the same person twice, but you perform that treatment in between there. You change the circumstances. So without drunk goggles and then with the drunk goggles, or before you've been taught the material, after you've been taught the material. And then the last topic, and we're not really going to cover it, is a block design. And we don't really cover it, but essentially a block design is you have two large groups. And then, so let's say, as an example, you're still doing something with aspirin, but now you want to check the effectiveness of aspirin versus Tylenol or acetaminophen, which is Tylenol. And so you'd have two large groups of people, and you'd put, let's say, 100 people in the group that are getting aspirin and 100 people in the group that are getting acetaminophen. And then within each of those groups of 100, you would have multiple treatment groups. So you'd have a control group in each of those blocks. So you'd have an aspirin control group and an acetaminophen control group. And then maybe you have a 10 milligrams and 20 milligrams group of aspirin people. And then maybe you have a 100 milligram and 150 milligram group of acetaminophen people. And then you collect data from all of those different groups. But that's the idea of a block design. And you can see more information on that at those pages listed in the online textbook if you desire. All right, that is the end of chapter 1. We will start chapter 2 next.